Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Church Ladies Sunday School Department. We are studying Genesis. We are on chapter 47. Last week, when we were doing chapter 46, we saw the reunion of Jacob and Joseph. Jacob and Joseph hadn't seen each other for 22 years. It was a very emotional, wonderful reunion. Joseph sat down with his brothers and told his brothers that they have an invitation from Pharaoh. Pharaoh sent carts to bring Jacob, the wives, the children. He told them to leave everything you've got, just load up and come on back. I'll take care of you here in Egypt. We are going to make you at home here. We'll take care of you. Don't worry about a thing. But that wasn't God's plan. That wasn't Joseph's plan or Jacob's. They did not want to go that way into Egypt. They wanted to take everything they owned with them at a time. And Joseph has a plan on how he can keep his family together and keep them where they more than likely will not become acclimated or assimilated into Egyptian culture, and that is to put them in Goshen. Goshen is a part of Egypt that is Egypt, yet it's not. It's kind of like Puerto Rico is to the United States. There were no Egyptian temples in Goshen. There were no places for the Egyptian priests to come and preach about their little g gods. As a result, the people in Goshen were not religious people. They were not counted as worthy of anything because they didn't attend the temples, and so they were outcast. Everyone that lived in Goshen. They were sheep herders, shepherds, cattlemen, and Egyptians looked down on these people. And that's who Jacob and his family are. So Joseph talks to his brothers. They have a plan on how to interact with Pharaoh, and hopefully Joseph's plan will have Pharaoh wanting them to settle in Goshen. Chapter 47, verses 1 through 3. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brothers, their flocks, their herds, and everything that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are here in the land of Goshen. Joseph took 5 men from among his brothers, and he presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to the brothers, What is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. This is directly following to a T what Joseph told him to answer. It would have been just a little bit off-putting to Pharaoh to realize that Joseph's family was here, but not how he had described for them to come. They had brought all of their animals, all of their livestock, and that wasn't quite what he had thought about. They're already in Goshen. That's where we keep all those livestock, all of the cattle, all of the herds of animals over there, the sheep, the goats, the cattle. And as he talks to these 5 brothers of Joseph's, we're not told what, or who these 5 brothers were. I can tell you 3 that I don't think would have been included in those. We have Reuben, who is the oldest, and you would think would be one of the 5, but Reuben was unstable as water. That's the way his dad's going to describe him. He was runs off at the mouth, says things he doesn't really mean. He seems to be very insecure. He makes very bad decisions, or has so far. And then the 2 others would be Simeon and Levi. They have been very violent. They have been hotheads. They have been violent just for the sake of being violent. They are very hard to handle troublemakers. That would be two you wouldn't want to take to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is very interested in the security of his country, and if he got these brothers in there and they impressed him that they would be a danger to Egypt, no matter what he thinks about Joseph, he wouldn't have allowed them to stay. So Joseph has selected 5 brothers that he can trust, feels he can trust to follow directions, who are wise enough to stay quiet when they need to be quiet. And he's chosen well. In verses 4, 5, and 6, and the brothers said to Pharaoh, "We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, and he said, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land, and let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock." He is agreeing for them to be in Goshen. Herdsmen, shepherds are abominations to most Egyptians. Pharaoh's a little bit more advanced than that because he himself owns herds of cattle, herds of sheep, herds of goats, and so he is more open, and he has said, let them have the best land in Egypt. While most people would think that it's just a politician talking, and I thought that too at the beginning. If you look at the land of Goshen and how it's set up, it is, for a man running livestock, it is the best in Egypt. Notice that the brothers in verse 4 say they want to dwell, and they say it twice. What we have in when I'm reading this, I'm reading this from the New King James Version of the Bible. And if you go and look in the Old King James, or you look in other versions, instead of dwell, it will say sojourn. Sojourn means I want to come, stay for a while, and then leave. May come for a purpose, and then when that purpose is exhausted, I don't plan on staying any longer, I'm leaving. When the brothers say this, the brothers are fully intending on, as soon as the famine is over, leaving. Jacob knows this is not true. Joseph knows this is not true. This is not what's going to happen. God has revealed otherwise. But the brothers either believe they're going to go home, or they're just wishing. But then Pharaoh, when he uses the word dwell in verse 6, the word that is Old Hebrew for that is not the same as sojourn. It is for settle. So Pharaoh is intending all along for Joseph's family to settle. He doesn't want to lose Joseph. I want to read the last part of verse 6 along with verse 7. And I want you to, because when I first read this, many times I read this, I did not read the two together. And I really think it's important. It makes a great statement. Okay, the last part of verse 6. And if, Pharaoh's speaking, he said, and if you know any competent men, and what he means is a man of great integrity, a man of authority, a man like you, Joseph. Are there any more at home just like you? Are any of your brothers, your kinsmen, are they like you? If so, would like to make them the chief herdsman over my livestock. I've got a job for them to do. And immediately, look what Joseph does next. In verse 7, Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Okay, something a little unusual is going on here. When Pharaoh asked about a man of integrity, of authority, who knew how to make his venture into livestock be profitable. The man immediately that came to mind for Joseph was his own father Jacob. Jacob had made Laban rich with all of his decisions about his own sheep and goat and cattle, and he had made himself wealthy with the decisions he made about all the livestock. So Joseph knew exactly who to bring in. Now I want you to picture this old man. He's 130 years old. He's lived in the desert and the areas near to a desert all of his life. His skin would be dark brown. He would look like leather, okay? He would have a full gray beard. He would be stooped over from his age, and he would also walk with a limp. Joseph felt like he needed the stabilizing of his arm as he brought him in, probably, and set him before Pharaoh. He probably brought in a chair and sat down for his father. Notice what Jacob does. Jacob is going to be Jacob. Okay? He's not taking instructions. He comes in, he immediately greets Pharaoh with a blessing. In Hebrews 7:7, we find that it is customary for the more powerful to bless the least powerful. This is a spiritual giant. This is one of our patriarchs. This man knows God intimately, and he blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh looks at him, would have been taken aback a little bit. And he looks at him and he looks at this dried up man, this old man. Gives me the impression that maybe in Egypt men don't live the length that the Israelites, the Hebrews, do. And he looked at him and said, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." He thought, first of all, of a pilgrimage. He's searching for a place. God had told him he'd take him there. He knows he's not there yet, so he counts everything as a pilgrimage as he journeys toward where God wants him to be. He says, "I'm 130 years old and it's been hard. I've had a lot of trouble in my life." What are some of the troubles that you know that Jacob has faced? What about Esau? What about having to leave home? What about deceiving his father? Losing his mother? What about fleeing to Laban and Laban's treachery? Waking up on the morning after his wedding and find out he's got Leah and not Rachel, whom he loves. Then marrying Rachel and finding the two ladies do a lot of infighting. They make his life pretty miserable. He ends up with 4 women. He has 2 wives and 2 concubines. My husband has a hard time with 1 wife. Can you imagine having 4? How would his home life would have been like? He ended up having to sneak out, run away from Laban, and he had to go through all of that. He wrestled with Jesus and ended up with a permanent limp when Jesus touched his hip and threw it out of socket. The results of that was a lifelong limp. He traveled and traveled and traveled, and he met Esau, the worry of meeting Esau again. Simeon and Levi, they avenged their sister's rape by killing a whole village full of men, a whole town full of men. They were so violent. Jacob thought it would be wise to get out of town, so he had to move his whole family because of their violent tendencies. He lost Rachel, and then he had to grieve the loss of Joseph. For 22 years, he thought Joseph was dead. The stress of the famine, the stress of thinking he might end up losing Benjamin as well. Now the move to Egypt wouldn't have been easy for a 130-year-old man. And he talks about his father's ages. Terah was 205, Abraham 175, Isaac 180, Jacob, him himself at 130, would have felt young. And he feels like he's fallen short of the faith of his fathers as well. One of the main reasons is his fathers, his grandfathers and fathers, Abraham and Isaac, are buried in Canaan. His mother and his grandmother are buried in Canaan. His wife Leah is born in Canaan. And here he is in Egypt. And he's feeling like that's not where God wants him to be. Jacob, in verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh again. And then he goes out before Pharaoh. He leaves the room. Now we're going forward just a few days, a few weeks. And verse 11 and 12, Joseph situates his father and his brothers, and he gave them the possessions in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all of his father's household with bread according to the number of their families. When it says Ramesses, that's another name for Goshen. When it was all known as Goshen at this time, but when Moses was writing this, some 400 years later, the name had evolved to Ramesses, the land of Ramesses. Then, if you'll look in verse 12, Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and his father's household with bread. He made sure they had plenty to eat in this time of famine. But the problem of it was when the last phrase, according to the number in their families, the year of famine was in the second year. There was a lot of people who were already starving at this time, and Joseph had started rationing the food pretty tightly, and he rationed the food that went to his family as well. He made sure they had it, but he didn't give them abundantly over what the Egyptians themselves. Remember, Jesus is a prototype of Jesus Christ. If you don't think Jesus Christ would do it, then don't think that Joseph would do it, because he is displaying to us, the Bible has him displaying to us traits that Jesus himself displayed when he was walking the earth. In verse 13, now there was no bread in all of the land, we're leaving Jacob's story and we're going to Joseph to show you how the government was run during this time of famine, how Joseph managed to keep food there for this nation of Egypt and all the countryside people who were coming in as well. Now there was no bread in all of the land of Egypt, and the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. People were starving. Notice they didn't say Goshen here. And Joseph gathered up all of the money which was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's house. He charged the people money for their food. Why did he do that? Why didn't he just hand it to them? Because you don't appreciate things that are just handed to you. You didn't in that day and time, and you don't now. These people had to understand how tight and desperate things were going to be. They had to be very careful with the food product. And if they had to buy it, they're going to be a lot more careful with it than if it was handed to them. It's human nature to waste. It's not human nature to save. That squirrels do that. They would become more frugal, though. The people would, as they paid for it. They would watch their consumption. There's no free lunch. The Bible never teaches that there should be a free lunch for people who are able to work. And Joseph did not want an entitled citizenry. Verse 15, so when the money failed in all the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all of the Egyptians came to Joseph, and they said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? for the money has failed. Remember our own depression in the United States when the banks failed. This sounds a lot like the same kind of story, doesn't it? All the money is now in Pharaoh's treasury. Joseph didn't keep it for himself. He was working for the government, and he was taking care of that. We're out of money, they said. And they wanted, what would they want Joseph to do? They wanted Joseph to give them food. This was they felt an entitlement. Okay? They did not or would not appreciate the value of conserving their food, of being ultra careful with it, and they felt like, I want something, the government should provide it. In verse 16 and 17, 16, then Joseph said, give your livestock, and I'll give you bread for your livestock. If the money is gone, we'll go to bartering. You have something of worth, and I have the grain. You can trade for it. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and of the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. Now this was the end of year 2, probably the end of year 3 by now. At the end of year 3, where do they feed their livestock? Where do they feed the herds of cattle? In Goshen. And that's where Pharaoh's flocks were. So as Joseph took these flocks in, they would have made their way to Goshen. Genesis 47, 18 and 19. When that year had ended, and they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my Lord that our money is gone. My Lord also has our herds of livestock. There's nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed, that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. Did you notice they didn't say, give me? They have lost the air of entitlement. They have struggled enough now that all they want to do is work. They want to survive, and they're willing to work. I know what this says, but a little bit later, it'll be explained just a little bit more. They're not really asking to be slaves. They're asking to be servants. They're asking to be indentured servants. They are asking for a way to earn bread. They are asking that their land be leased. They wouldn't be interested in seed if they didn't want their land back. So they're offering themselves as indentured servants, and they're offering their land for lease. In verse 47, 20 and 21, Joseph says, okay, but we need a contract. You need to know exactly what to expect from me. I need to know exactly what to expect from you. So the contract is going to be made, and this is during the 4th year of the famine. And we've still got all of 4 to go, 5 to go, 6 to go, 7 to go. And then even when the famine is over, you have to have enough time for them to be able to plant and harvest. So at least have another year. Then Joseph bought. The original Hebrew said to acquire the right to something. And he offered them a percentage of their harvest after the famine was over. Much like if hunters today lease land to go hunt, that lease or rent a house or something. So in verse 20, so Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them, so the land became Pharaoh's. It's hard to watch your family starve. And as for the people, Joseph moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other. All of the people who lived on the farms during the land of plenty watched their grain, 20% of their grain, be taken into the nearest city and stored there. They were told that there was going to be a famine coming, and that this taxation of grain was going to be what was going to be used to feed them during the famine. With this knowledge, they watched that grow, and they didn't mind giving 20% taxation. They didn't mind at all. You see, their tax was very fluid, and some of the pharaohs wanted 30 and 40%. When the Babylonians came, they even wanted 60% taxation. So 20 wasn't that bad, especially since it was time of plenty, when they were making more than they ever had before, and they could see the 20% being siloed in the cities for future use. So now they're unable to farm. Everything is too dry. The drought has taken its toll. Joseph has to do two things. He needs to move these people into the cities. That's where the grain is at, so that he can have an ease of feeding them. He also needs to move them into the cities because that's where the work is at. Remember, in our depression, a lot of the things in our Smoky Mountains Parks area was built during this, when the government paid men to work for them. And that's what Joseph is doing. He's paying these men to work on public projects. And what is their pay? Food. They're working for their food. Genesis 47:22-23. Only the land of the Egyptian priest he did not buy, for the priest had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. Then Joseph said to the people, Indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is a seed for you, and you shall sow the land. Some people that I've heard teach and preach on this right now, they're saying, well, look, the famine is about to end. No, it's not. He's doing the exact same thing he did when he took the 20% of their grain during the times of plenty and he put it where the people could see it. He's taking part of that. He's taking the seed and he's putting it in a special place. And he's saying, there is your seed. When the famine is over, there is your hope. I have faith. The Lord has told me, that has told Pharaoh and me, it is going to be over. And when it's over, you're going to use that seed and go back to the farm. It makes sense. Why would he bring them into the city if he was going to give them the grain to plant while they were in the city? That doesn't make sense. So the next verse is verse 24 and 25. And it shall come to pass in the harvest, when the famine is over, this is still part of the contract now, that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 will be your own, as seed for the field, and for your food, and for your households, and food for your little ones. He said, when you get the seed and you plant it, and then you get harvest, 20% of it is coming back to Pharaoh in the form of taxes. And they said in verse 25, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord. We will be Pharaoh's servants. See here, they use the word servants, not slaves. All right, and why are they so tickled? Because Joseph has just set the taxation at a stable, level amount of 20%. They were doing that before, and they did just fine. They can have hope for the future now, and they are delighted. They're shouting for joy for what Joseph has done for them. In verse 26, Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priest, which did not become Pharaoh's. Moses is writing this some 400 years later, and he's saying it's still allowed today in Egypt. Okay, switching gears in the chapter, we're going back to Jacob's family. And this is some 15, 16 years later than when we last saw Jacob. Almost 17 years since we last saw Jacob in our in this chapter. In verse 27, 28, and 29. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Note the wording. They grew, they multiplied, they were exceeding. Remember when Jesus says, verily, verily, you better pay attention because he's really saying that for emphasis. Well, here it is, the same concept said 3 times. It means, men, did they grow? They grew in number, and they grew in stature in Egypt. So much so it got Egypt worried, but we won't go there yet. In verse 28, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. We know Jacob died at 147 years, so we're real close to the end of his life. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, Now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me, and please do not bury me in Egypt. Jacob is reaching the end of his life, and he's thinking about his death. And he's thinking about, here I am in Egypt, and I want to be in Canaan. I want to be in Canaan with Leah and Abraham and Isaac and Rachel and Rebekah. I don't want to die here. So he calls his son. Joseph comes, and he says, if I have found favor with you, he said, please do something for me. He said, I want you to take my body and bury me at home in Canaan. Don't bury me here. Now, this was more than a promise. This was an oath he was asking his son to take. Are you familiar with how they take an oath at that time? When he said, you've read this, we have talked about this before, when they said, put your hand under my thigh. It's not really the thigh he's putting his hand under. The person requesting that someone swear an oath, is the man is in a sitting position. The man who is going to do the swearing kneels in front of him, takes his cupped hand, and under his clothing, not next to the skin, under his clothing, he puts his hand under his genitalia and holds it there while he takes the oath that he's being requested to say. Joseph said, let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial places. And Joseph said, I will do as you've said. That's like a promise. And then Jacob got a little bit more angst in his voice, and he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. And that's how he would have sworn. He would have put his hand under his father's clothing in his genital areas, and he would have swore that he would take his body back home to Canaan and bury it with Abraham and with Isaac. And then he would have withdrawn his hand. Why? Why? That was very common, and not just in Hebrews, in that area and during that time. The why is what he's actually saying. If I fail to do this, your family can come and take my life. I am promising my life that I will do what you ask. And if I can't do it, or I don't do it, I am to be held accountable. And it's not just your immediate family. This could go on for generations. This still goes on with the secure law in the Muslims. Okay, this type of oath was the most finalizing oath they could take in this day and time. And we're going to leave Joseph here, but we'll pick him up in chapter 48. Have a wonderful week.